The winter of 1950 in North Korea brought a cold so severe that it became as deadly an enemy as the bullets and mortars that rained down on American soldiers. This is the story of young Americans who traveled halfway around the world to fight in a conflict most people back home barely understood, only to find themselves battling not just communist forces, but the worst winter conditions any American military force had ever faced in combat. This is the story of how the cold killed, how it maimed, how it broke men down to their most basic instincts for survival, and how those who lived carried the scars, both visible and invisible, for the rest of their lives. In June 1950, North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel, catching the world by surprise and pushing South Korean and the small American forces stationed there into a desperate retreat. The United States, still recovering from World War II, but determined to stop the spread of communism, committed itself to defending South Korea. Through the brutal summer months, American soldiers fought a retreating action down the Korean peninsula, pushed back to a small perimeter around the port city of Busan. The heat was oppressive, the fighting was intense, and casualties mounted, but they held the line. Then came September and General Douglas MacArthur's brilliant amphibious landing at Incheon. In one bold stroke, United Nations forces cut off the North Korean supply lines and began pushing north. The North Korean army collapsed. Within weeks, American and South Korean forces were racing toward the Chinese border, toward the Yalu River. The war seemed won. MacArthur promised the troops they would be home for Christmas. The mood was optimistic, almost celebratory. Intelligence reports suggested the Chinese would not intervene. The rapid advance north meant that supply lines stretched thin, but the prevailing attitude was that the war was effectively over. It was just a matter of mopping up remaining North Korean resistance. But the intelligence was catastrophically wrong. China had been moving hundreds of thousands of troops across the Yalu River under cover of darkness, hiding in the mountains and valleys of North Korea's rugged terrain. They moved without vehicles when possible, marching at night, hiding during the day. They were masters of camouflage and concealment. American aerial reconnaissance saw nothing. The Chinese soldiers wore quilted uniforms that blended into the winter landscape. They carried minimal equipment, living on rice and whatever they could forage. They were tough, disciplined, and they were waiting. As October turned to November, the weather began to change. The temperatures started dropping. The men who had spent months fighting in the brutal Korean summer heat now faced the opposite extreme, and most of them were not prepared for what was coming. The American military had not adequately supplied its forces with cold weather gear. Many soldiers still wore summer uniforms or light jackets. The winter clothing that did exist was often stuck in supply depots far to the south or was still being shipped from the United States. The rapid advance north had outpaced the supply system. The terrain itself was unforgiving. North Korea's landscape is dominated by mountains, steep ridges, narrow valleys, and winding roads. The Taebaek Mountains run like a spine down the eastern side of the peninsula. Travel was difficult even in good weather. The roads were primitive, often nothing more than dirt tracks that turned to mud with rain or snow. Villages were few and far between. The land was harsh, unforgiving, and as the temperatures dropped, it became a frozen hell. November brought the first serious cold. Temperatures began dropping below freezing at night. Soldiers who had been sleeping in the open or in light tents now found themselves shivering through the nights. But this was just the beginning. The real cold had not yet arrived. Still, even these early freezing temperatures caused problems. Equipment began to malfunction. Vehicle engines became hard to start. Oil thickened. Water in canteens froze. Men's breath turned to ice crystals in the air. On November 25, 1950, China launched its massive second phase offensive. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers attacked along the entire front. American and UN forces, spread thin across the mountainous terrain, suddenly found themselves surrounded, cut off, and fighting for survival. The Chinese attacked at night, using bugles and whistles to coordinate their movements and to terrify the Americans. They came in waves, absorbing casualties that would have caused any Western army to break, but they kept coming. Their tactics relied on overwhelming numbers, infiltration, and the encirclement of smaller American units. The Eighth Army on the western side of the peninsula began a fighting retreat southward, but it was in the east, at a place called the Chosin Reservoir, that the most desperate battle unfolded. The 1st Marine Division, along with elements of the Army's 7th Infantry Division, found themselves trapped in the mountains surrounding this frozen reservoir. They were cut off from the rest of the UN forces, surrounded by Chinese divisions that outnumbered them by perhaps 10 to 1, and the temperature was dropping to levels that seem almost impossible to believe. The thermometer plunged to 20 below zero Fahrenheit, then 30 below, then 40 below. Some reports claimed it hit as low as 50 below zero. At these temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes, breath freezes in the air, metal becomes so cold that touching it with bare skin causes instant frostbite, weapons malfunction, vehicle fluids freeze solid, the human body begins to shut down, prioritizing core functions and sacrificing extremities. Fingers and toes go numb first, then hands and feet. Without proper protection, a man could lose his ability to function as a soldier within hours. The Marines and soldiers at Chosin Reservoir faced a nightmare scenario. They were surrounded by enemy forces determined to destroy them, and they were fighting in the coldest conditions any American military force had ever experienced in sustained combat. The Chinese had some advantages in dealing with the cold. Many came from the harsh climate of northern China and Manchuria. They were accustomed to severe winters. Their quilted uniforms, while not sophisticated, provided decent insulation. They moved constantly, which helped generate body heat, but even the Chinese suffered terribly from the cold. Thousands of Chinese soldiers froze to death in their positions. Some were found frozen solid, still in fighting positions, rifles in hand, aimed at the American lines, but never fired because the soldier had frozen before he could pull the trigger. For the Americans, the cold was an enemy unlike anything they had trained for. Most of these men were young, many barely out of their teens. They had joined the military during World War II or shortly after, expecting to serve their time and go home. Now they found themselves in a frozen wasteland, fighting an enemy that seemed to appear out of nowhere and fighting temperatures that killed as efficiently as bullets. The cold attacked the body in stages. First came the shivering, the body's attempt to generate heat through muscle movement. But shivering burns calories, and many of the men at Chosin were already operating on reduced rations. Supply drops were irregular, and much of what did get through was ammunition, not food. Hungry men get cold faster. Their bodies have less fuel to burn. As core body temperature drops, the shivering becomes violent, uncontrollable. Men's teeth chattered so hard they chipped or broke. Speech became slurred, difficult. Decision-making became impaired. This is when mistakes happened, when men wandered away from their units, when they failed to recognize danger, when they simply sat down and stopped moving. The cold affected the mind as much as the body. Below a certain core temperature, the shivering stops. This is a critical danger sign. It means the body has exhausted its ability to generate heat through muscle action. Now the core temperature drops faster. Confusion sets in, often accompanied by a paradoxical feeling of warmth. Men in the late stages of hypothermia sometimes began removing their clothes, convinced they were too hot. They would be found hours later, frozen to death, partially undressed in the snow. The mind was playing tricks, and those tricks were fatal. Frostbite was even more common than hypothermia. Exposed flesh froze quickly. Fingers and toes were most vulnerable. The body, trying to preserve core temperature, restricted blood flow to the extremities. In the extreme cold, this meant fingers and toes froze while the soldier was still conscious and functioning. Many men did not realize the severity of their frostbite until it was too late. The frozen tissue is numb, painless at first. Only later, when warming occurred or when the damage was severe enough, did the pain begin. Soldiers discovered that touching metal with bare hands in the extreme cold caused the skin to stick to the metal and tear away. Gun barrels, vehicle parts, even zippers became hazards. Men learned to handle their weapons with gloves on, but gloves made it harder to manipulate triggers and other controls. It was a constant balance between maintaining dexterity and protecting skin. The weapons themselves became unreliable. The M1 Garand rifle, the standard infantry weapon, was designed to operate in temperate climates. In the extreme cold of Chosin, the oil in the rifles thickened to the consistency of molasses. Rifles that had been meticulously cleaned and maintained suddenly would not fire. The recoil springs lost their tension. Shell casings stuck in chambers. Some rifles had to be fired manually, working the bolt action by hand because the semi-automatic mechanism had frozen. The Marines learned to strip out all the lubricants from their weapons, running them dry. This increased wear and the risk of malfunction from another direction, but it was better than having a rifle that would not fire at all. Machine guns faced similar problems. The Browning automatic rifle, the M1919 machine gun, all of them experienced freezing issues. Crews kept their weapons under blankets when possible, trying to retain some warmth. They rotated crew members, not just because of fatigue, but because hands became too cold to operate the weapons effectively. A machine gunner whose fingers were numb from cold could not accurately aim or control his weapon. Mortars became difficult to use. The base plates had to be firmly planted, but the frozen ground was like concrete. Digging in was nearly impossible. The ground was frozen so hard that entrenching tools bounced off it. Men trying to dig foxholes for protection found they could barely scratch the surface. Some resorted to using explosives to blast shallow depressions in the ground that provided minimal cover. Others piled rocks, but rocks provided poor protection against bullets and fragments, and they conducted cold efficiently, making positions even colder. Vehicle engines had to be kept running constantly or they would freeze and become impossible to start. This required a constant supply of fuel, which was in short supply. Drivers took turns sleeping while others kept the engines running. Antifreeze was added to radiators in quantities that would normally be considered excessive, but even that sometimes was not enough. Batteries lost their charge in the cold. Vehicles that did stop running often could not be restarted and had to be abandoned. Medical treatment became a critical challenge. Wounded men faced a dual threat. The wounds themselves could be fatal, but the cold killed just as efficiently. A man bleeding from a wound lost body heat rapidly. Blood loss combined with cold led to shock and death faster than in temperate conditions. Medics struggled to treat casualties. Plasma and blood for transfusions froze. Morphine syrettes, the small disposable injectors carried by medics to treat pain, froze solid and became useless. Medics had to carry them inside their clothing, next to their skin, to keep them liquid. Even then, administering morphine was risky. The cold affected how the drug was metabolized, and dosing had to be done carefully. Wounded men often froze to death before they could be evacuated. The evacuation process itself was difficult and dangerous. The roads were icy, narrow, and under constant enemy attack. Ambulances moved slowly in convoy, vulnerable to ambush and artillery fire. The Chinese knew the Americans would try to evacuate their wounded and targeted the evacuation routes. Some wounded men waited for hours or even days before they could be moved. Lying in the snow, even with blankets, the cold seeped into their bodies. Shock, blood loss, and hypothermia combined to kill men who might have survived their wounds in a different climate. The aid stations and field hospitals were overwhelmed. The tents where medical staff worked provided minimal protection from the cold. Surgical procedures were conducted in barely above freezing temperatures. Doctors and nurses worked wearing multiple layers of clothing and gloves when possible, but delicate surgical work required bare hands, and medical staff suffered frostbite on their fingers from prolonged exposure while treating patients. Blood and fluids froze in containers. Medical instruments became painfully cold to handle. Amputation became common. Frostbite severe enough to cause tissue death required removal of the affected part to prevent gangrene and death. Fingers, toes, hands, feet, ears, noses, all were lost to the cold. Some men lost multiple limbs. A soldier who survived the fighting, who was not shot or wounded by fragments, could still lose his feet to frostbite and be invalided out of the service, disabled for life. The psychological impact of the cold was profound. Men watched their buddies succumb to the cold, saw strong soldiers reduced to shivering, incoherent shadows of themselves. The constant discomfort, the inability to ever feel warm, the knowledge that simply stopping moving could mean death, all of this wore down morale. Fear of the cold became as real as fear of enemy fire. Some men broke psychologically, becoming catatonic or hysterical. The term shell shock from earlier wars did not quite capture what was happening. This was something different, a combination of combat stress and the physical and psychological effects of prolonged exposure to life-threatening cold. Yet despite all of this, the Marines and soldiers at Chosin Reservoir fought. They fought the Chinese attacks that came wave after wave through the darkness. They fought to hold their positions, to protect their wounded, to keep the roads open. They fought knowing they were outnumbered and surrounded, knowing that relief was not coming, that their only hope was to fight their way out. The breakout from the Chosin Reservoir became one of the epic actions in Marine Corps history. Rather than surrender or be destroyed in place, the 1st Marine Division fought its way south, down the narrow road through mountain passes, battling Chinese forces on the surrounding heights, all while the temperature remained at lethal levels. They carried their wounded with them, refusing to leave anyone behind. They destroyed equipment that could not be transporting to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. They moved slowly, fighting for every mile, but they moved. The march out of Chosin took days. Each day brought new Chinese attacks. Each night brought temperatures that dropped even further. Men who had not slept more than a few hours in the past week were now expected to march carrying full combat loads, to fight when attacked, to help carry the wounded. Exhaustion became total. Men fell asleep while walking, stumbling along until they collided with the man in front of them. Others dozed while riding on vehicles, huddled together for warmth. Food was scarce. The supplies that did make it through focused on ammunition and medical supplies. Men went days on minimal rations. They melted snow for water, but melting snow requires heat, which requires fuel, which was also in short supply. Drinking cold water or eating snow lowered core body temperature, but dehydration was also a danger. It was another impossible choice in a situation full of them. Sleep was almost impossible. The cold prevented real sleep. Men could doze, could slip into a kind of semi-conscious state, but true restorative sleep required warmth and safety, neither of which existed. The body cannot properly rest when it is constantly fighting to maintain core temperature. The cumulative exhaustion built day after day until men were functioning on pure willpower and adrenaline. The Chinese forces attacking the column suffered as well. They were farther from their supply bases, moving through the same frozen landscape. They had fewer vehicles, less artillery support, less of everything except manpower, but they had the advantage of the high ground, positions in the mountains overlooking the road. They could set up ambushes, roll grenades down slopes, fire down on the American column. Chinese soldiers accepted casualties that would be considered catastrophic by American standards. Entire companies would be decimated in attacks, yet the attacks continued. Along the road out of Chosin, the evidence of the fighting and the cold was everywhere. Destroyed vehicles, burned and abandoned, lined the roadside. Bodies of Chinese and American soldiers lay in the snow, frozen in the positions where they had fallen. Equipment was scattered, discarded when units had to lighten their loads to keep moving. The detritus of battle and retreat marked every mile. The Air Force and Marine Corps aviation provided crucial support. Planes flew missions in weather that would normally ground them, providing close air support to the ground forces and flying out the most seriously wounded. The airstrip at Hagarurai, a small village along the reservoir, became a lifeline. Engineers worked around the clock to maintain and expand the strip. Planes landed on ice and snow, loaded with wounded, and took off again. Some planes were shot down by Chinese anti-aircraft fire. Others crashed due to weather or mechanical failure in the cold, but they kept flying. The pilots and crews faced their own battles with the cold. At altitude, temperatures in unpressurized aircraft were even lower than on the ground. Pilots wore electrically heated flight suits, but these sometimes malfunctioned. Windscreens froze over, limiting visibility. Instruments failed. Fuel lines froze. Yet they continued to fly missions, knowing that the men on the ground depended on them. As the column moved south, it reached the coast at the port of Hungnam. Here, the Navy had assembled ships for evacuation. The 7th Fleet provided cover, offshore guns hammering Chinese positions. The Marines and soldiers reached the sea, boarded ships, and were evacuated. They brought their wounded, their equipment, and even refugees, Korean civilians who knew that staying behind meant death or worse under communist rule. The evacuation from Hungnam in December 1950 marked the end of the Chosin Reservoir Campaign, but it did not end the war or the suffering from cold. The war would continue for 2.5 more years. American forces would fight through another winter in 1951 and 1952, though none would be quite as severe as that first terrible winter. The front lines stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel where the war had started, and the fighting became a bloody stalemate of trench warfare and hill fighting that resembled World War I more than the mobile warfare earlier in the conflict. But for the men who fought at Chosin, the experience marked them forever. Many carried physical scars. Amputations from frostbite were common. Missing fingers, toes, feet, hands, these were the visible reminders. Some men lost ears or parts of their noses. The cold had disfigured them in ways that bullets and shrapnel might not have. These injuries affected their lives in countless ways. Simple tasks became difficult or impossible. Employment options narrowed. The Veterans Administration hospitals would treat thousands of cold weather injuries in the years that followed. The invisible wounds were harder to quantify but just as real. Today we would call it post-traumatic stress disorder, but in the 1950s it was not well understood or treated. Men came home from Korea with nightmares, with hypervigilance, with an inability to adjust to civilian life. The memories of the cold, of watching friends die, of killing enemy soldiers, of constant danger and deprivation, these memories did not fade. Many veterans did not talk about their experiences. The Korean War quickly became known as the Forgotten War, overshadowed by World War II before it and Vietnam after it. Veterans found that people were not interested in hearing about Korea, so they kept silent, but the memories remained. Research after the war examined what had happened and why American forces had been so unprepared for the cold. The conclusions were damning. Intelligence had failed to predict both the Chinese intervention and the severity of the weather. Supply and logistics had failed to get cold, where the gear to the troops before it was desperately needed. Training had not prepared soldiers for fighting in extreme cold. Equipment had not been tested or designed for such conditions. The entire system had failed, and the price was paid in the blood and suffering of the men on the ground. The military learned from Chosin. Cold weather training became mandatory. Equipment was redesigned and tested in cold weather conditions. The modern military vapor barrier boots, extreme cold weather clothing systems, cold weather tents and sleeping bags, all of these trace their lineage back to the lessons learned in Korea. The Army and Marines established cold weather training centers where soldiers learned how to survive and fight in extreme conditions. Medical understanding of hypothermia and frostbite improved, and treatment protocols were developed. But these improvements came too late for the men who fought in that first Korean winter. They had been sent into the cold unprepared and had paid a terrible price. Official casualty figures from the Chosin Reservoir Campaign list over 700 killed in action, several thousand wounded, and hundreds missing. But these numbers do not capture the full cost. Thousands more suffered cold weather injuries. Some died from the cold without ever being shot. Others were so weakened by the cold that wounds they might have survived proved fatal. Still others survived, but were never the same, physically or mentally. The Chinese casualties were even higher, though exact numbers remain disputed. Estimates suggest the Chinese suffered tens of thousands of casualties at Chosin, many from the cold. The Chinese forces were even less prepared for sustained operations in such temperatures. Their supply lines were longer and more tenuous. They had even less food and medical support than the Americans. Chinese soldiers froze to death by the thousands. Some entire units were rendered combat ineffective by cold casualties before they even engaged American forces. The cold did not discriminate. It killed Chinese and Americans alike. It disabled the strong and the weak. It turned the battlefield into a frozen wasteland where survival itself was an achievement and where victory was measured not in ground gained, but in men brought out alive. In the broader context of the Korean War, Chosin Reservoir and the Chinese intervention changed everything. The war that seemed won in October became a desperate fight for survival in November. The United Nations forces retreated south, giving up all the territory gained in the advance to the Yalu River. Seoul, the South Korean capital, fell to communist forces for the second time. It seemed possible that UN forces might be pushed off the peninsula entirely. The mood in Washington turned grim. Talk of using atomic weapons circulated. MacArthur pushed for expanding the war into China itself, which ultimately led to his relief by President Truman. By spring 1951, UN forces had stabilized the front and even pushed back north again. The war settled into the grinding stalemate that would characterize the next 2 years. But the optimism of that first autumn, the belief that the war could be won quickly, was gone forever. Korea taught the limits of American power and the dangers of overconfidence and poor intelligence. For the soldiers who fought there, Korea represented a different kind of war. It was not the clear-cut moral crusade of World War II, where the enemy was unambiguously evil and the cause was universally supported. Korea was confusing, limited, and frustrating. The goals were unclear. The enemy was sometimes North Korean, sometimes Chinese. The South Korean government that Americans were dying to defend was corrupt and authoritarian. There were no cheering crowds welcoming liberators, no ticker-tape parades. Just cold and death and suffering, and then eventually going home to a country that seemed largely indifferent to what they had experienced. The cold at Chosin became legendary in military circles. Stories were told and retold. The men who were there formed veteran associations, gathering annually to remember their fallen comrades and to share their experiences with each other because no one else could truly understand. They spoke of the cold in terms that civilians found hard to grasp. 40 below zero is not something most Americans have experienced. It is difficult to convey how such cold feels, how it attacks the body, how it fills the mind. Some of the most poignant stories from Chosin involve small acts of humanity in the midst of horror. Men sharing their rations with wounded buddies, soldiers giving their gloves or extra socks to those who had lost theirs, Marines carrying wounded men on their backs for miles, medics treating casualties despite their own injuries. Acts of courage and compassion that exemplified the best of the human spirit, even in the worst conditions imaginable. There were also stories of the enemy. Chinese prisoners captured by American forces told of their own suffering from the cold, of watching their comrades freeze to death, of attacking American positions knowing they were walking into machine gun fire, because at least that death would be quick, not the slow agony of freezing. Some Chinese soldiers, faced with the choice of advancing into American fire or retreating back into the frozen mountains without food or shelter, chose to surrender. Others fought with desperate courage, knowing they had no other choice. The Korean War officially ended with an armistice in July 1953. Though technically the war never ended, there was never a peace treaty. The border between North and South Korea remained roughly where it had been in 1950, along the 38th parallel. Over 3 years of war, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and millions of civilians died. The peninsula was devastated. Families were divided, separated by a border that remains one of the most heavily militarized in the world. For the veterans of that first winter, the armistice brought an end to the fighting, but not to their struggle. They came home to a country eager to move on, to forget about the war. The 1950s were a time of prosperity and optimism in America. The war was an unpleasant memory that people preferred not to dwell on. Veterans found jobs, got married, started families. But the memories of Korea, of the cold and the fear and the friends who died, those memories did not fade. Medical science in the 1950s and 1960s had limited understanding of how to treat the long-term effects of severe frostbite. Men who lost toes or parts of their feet suffered chronic pain, difficulty walking, and arthritis. Circulation problems plagued those whose extremities had been frozen. Some required multiple surgeries over the years as complications developed. The cold had caused damage that would last a lifetime. The psychological wounds were even less understood. Shell shock or battle fatigue from earlier wars was recognized, but the treatment was rudimentary. Many veterans self-medicated with alcohol. Divorce rates among Korean War veterans were high. Some struggled with employment, unable to hold jobs or maintain relationships. Others seemed to adjust, but carried their trauma silently, never speaking of it even to their families. Children grew up knowing their fathers had been in the war, but knowing little else, sensing that this was a subject not to be raised. As the veterans aged, the effects of their time in Korea became more pronounced. The amputations and cold injuries that had been manageable in youth became more limiting with age. Men in their 60s and 70s found themselves in wheelchairs or using walkers, their mobility compromised by injuries sustained half a century earlier. Phantom pain from amputated limbs continued to torment some. Others developed circulatory problems related to their frostbite injuries. Recognition came slowly. In the 1980s and 1990s, as society became more aware of post-traumatic stress, and as the veterans themselves aged and began to confront their experiences, more attention was paid to the Korean War. Memorials were built, documentaries were made, books were written. The Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., dedicated in 1995, finally gave the war and its veterans a prominent place in the national memory. The statues of soldiers in ponchos, moving through rugged terrain, captured something of the hardship these men had endured. Survivors of Chosin gave interviews, wrote memoirs, spoke at schools and veteran groups. They wanted to ensure that what they had experienced was not forgotten, that future generations would know what had happened in that frozen reservoir in North Korea in 1950. They spoke with pride of what they had accomplished, fighting against overwhelming odds and surviving, but also with sorrow for those who had not made it home. The lessons of Korea, and specifically of Chosin, remain relevant. Modern military forces train extensively for operations in extreme environments. Equipment is designed and tested to operate in temperature extremes. Logistical planning accounts for the additional challenges of cold weather operations. Medical protocols for treating hypothermia and frostbite have improved dramatically. But even with all these improvements, the cold remains a formidable enemy. Military operations in Afghanistan, in the mountains in winter, have reminded new generations of soldiers that nature can be as deadly as any human enemy. The story of American soldiers freezing to death in Korea is ultimately a story about human endurance and the limits thereof. It is about young men sent to fight in conditions they were not prepared for, against an enemy they had been told would not intervene, in a war whose purpose many of them did not fully understand. It is about suffering and sacrifice, about men who did their duty despite conditions that would have broken lesser individuals. It is about the failures of leadership and intelligence that put those men in that situation, and about the courage and resilience that allowed them to survive. The cold at Chosin killed hundreds directly and contributed to the deaths of hundreds more. It maimed thousands. It touched every man who was there, leaving scars both visible and invisible. Those who survived carried the memory of that cold for the rest of their lives. They remembered the way their fingers went numb, the way their feet felt like blocks of ice, the way their breath froze in the air. They remembered friends who fell in the snow and never got up. They remembered the fear, not just of the enemy but of the cold itself, the knowledge that simply stopping, simply giving up, meant death. And they remembered what they accomplished. Against overwhelming odds, surrounded by enemy forces that outnumbered them perhaps 10 to 1, fighting in the worst weather conditions imaginable, they fought their way out. They brought their wounded with them. They maintained unit cohesion and discipline. They proved that even in the worst circumstances, American soldiers could fight and survive. The 1st Marine Division went into Chosin Reservoir as a fighting force and came out as a fighting force, battered and bloodied, but unbroken. That achievement came at a terrible cost. The men who fought at Chosin paid with their bodies and minds. Some gave everything, dying in the snow far from home. Others gave pieces of themselves, fingers and toes and feet, left behind in the Korean winter. Still others gave their peace of mind, carrying the trauma of that experience for the rest of their lives. The Korean War as a whole, and Chosin Reservoir specifically, stand as reminders of the unpredictability of war, of the ways that natural conditions can shape and determine outcomes as much as tactics or courage, and of the human cost of military operations. Every statistic, every casualty figure, represents an individual human being, someone's son or brother or father, a person with hopes and dreams who found themselves in circumstances beyond imagining. When we say that American soldiers froze to death in Korea, we are speaking of real people, young men from farms in Iowa and factories in Detroit and small towns across America. They were teenagers and men in their early 20s mostly. They had grown up during the Depression and World War II. They had joined the military for various reasons, some from patriotism, others for lack of other opportunities, still others because they were drafted. They expected to serve their time and return to normal lives. Instead, they found themselves in the mountains of North Korea in the winter of 1950, fighting for their lives against an enemy they had been told was defeated, in cold so extreme it killed as efficiently as enemy fire. They saw their friends die, felt their bodies beginning to fail from the cold, experienced fear and suffering that most people can barely imagine. And those who survived came home changed, carrying physical and psychological wounds that would never fully heal. This is their story. This is what happened when American soldiers fought in the Forgotten War, in the worst winter conditions any American force had ever faced in combat. It is a story of suffering and sacrifice, of failure and courage, of death and survival. It deserves to be remembered, not as an abstract historical event, but as a human tragedy and triumph. The men who fought there deserve to be honored and remembered. Their sacrifice should not be forgotten. This was the Korean War, the Forgotten War, and this is what it cost.